This is just a summary of a presentation I gave earlier on today, really just thinking through some ideas for developing pedagogy and particularly sort of curriculum and technology ideas using a hybrid of design-based research and lesson study. There's been another report recently that yet again calls into question the degree to which technology is successfully embedded within learning. These two quotes here are taken from the Nestor report on decoding learning, and yet again they stress the whole issue around the extent to which technology has helped improve learners' experiences across the country, really, rather than just with those few advocates who are very good with technology, and stating yet again that the evidence of digital technologies bringing real transformation to learning and teaching remaining elusive. And this is sort of something that's now been going on for a very long period of time. And with some research we've been doing over the last year, this sort of chimed yet again with some of the thinking that I've been doing in working alongside teachers, and also sort of looking at innovative approaches to my own practice with master's students and trainee teachers, to start thinking about how we not only embed technology successfully, but how we develop notions of curriculum alongside that, and indeed notions of pedagogy. So I've got some sort of main questions really that have been sort of playing on my mind for a while, I guess. So how do we create a deep understanding of the link between pedagogy and technology? Time and time again, publications have been written that really talk about technology not being embedded within pedagogy, mainly because quite often teachers are shown how to use technologies rather than sort of looking at sort of pedagogical problems and looking at how technology can be embedded from a pedagogical view. But then also an interest in how we can get a deeper understanding and link between pedagogy and curriculum. And in both cases, how we actually make change and innovation sustainable. It's quite easy to bring change and innovation over short periods of time for particular projects, but how do we make that embedded, and how do we make it sustainable? So in many ways, I suppose I'm looking at the intersection between curriculum, technology and pedagogy, and what's quite interesting about that is actually very similar in form to TPAC, sort of looking at technological pedagogical content knowledge, and the idea taken from PCK that actually really good teaching is at the intersection between having a very keen understanding of subject content, but also the pedagogies that will allow you to successfully convey that subject content and help other people unpack and understand that content knowledge, with the idea that technology then joins that, so that it's about how you use subject knowledge, technology and pedagogy together. Here I'm looking more sort of pedagogy, technology and curriculum. But I think there's an interesting issue here about how we begin to really get behind and unpack the shorter term detail of pedagogy, how we develop minute-to-minute critical approaches to teaching and learning, and how they then relate to the longer-term considerations of curriculum and technology. In terms of developing curriculum and or technology, taking them both together or separately, I think one really successful way of doing that is to use design-based research. This has been around now for the best part of a decade, and particularly within the sort of technological sphere, has started to gain traction, and also some really interesting research, particularly from groups in the Netherlands, looking at using this for developing notions around curriculum. And the notion of design-based research in many ways is quite simple. You start by having an analysis of a practical problem by a researcher and practitioners working in collaboration, and from analysing a situation and identifying and characterising a problem or an issue that you want to work on, the idea is that initially the researcher goes away, spends time looking at all of the research evidence within that particular area, and from that beginning to develop solutions that can inform sort of the way of going forward with that particular curriculum problem or technological problem. And once a solution has been found that is favoured by both the researcher and the practitioners, then moving into sort of iterative cycles of testing and refinement of solutions in practice. An example perhaps being a project I was involved in a couple of years ago, where I worked with a secondary department for 2 years to go through 3 iterations of a website to help students develop independent learning, whilst focusing on the whole idea of sort of hurricanes within geography. And then the idea is that once you get to a position where you're happy with the refined solution, you feel that you've got to some form of end point, then the final part of DBR is to see whether or not there are more generalizable design principles that you can that precipitate out of the process, so that you can take those forward to other contexts. And whilst you're going through the whole of that process, there's constant reflection and development of the various issues. So one way of looking at the sort of more medium to long-term development of both curriculum and technology is to use something like a design-based research approach. In the shorter term, i.e. looking at pedagogy, looking at the detail within, say, a single lesson, over the last year we've been working a lot with lesson study. And this is an approach to critical planning, learning and evaluation that comes from Japan, has been used there for the best part of 120 years, and has led to a system where the vast majority, if not all, teachers just see it as a natural part and process of their teaching careers. The idea being that groups of teachers work collaboratively together. They create a lesson study group that can be within a subject or across subjects, and they begin by looking at the learning of their students and identifying a specific challenge that they feel that those students have in their learning. It might be an area of content, it might be problems with understanding a particular concept, it might be looking at a particular skill or skill set. And having identified what that challenge is, the group of teachers then spends time basically planning a single lesson, a thing called the research lesson, and they plan it in detail together. It's a collaborative process, and it's a process where, whilst planning activities is obviously a part of that process, the main focus is on the students' learning. What is it, literally minute to minute, what is it that the students are doing? How do we think they are understanding this and hooking into it, and what's the process that they're going through to help them learn what it is that we want them to learn. Once the lesson has been planned, then the third element is for one of the group then to teach the lesson that's been planned, and the others in the group to observe the lesson. But importantly, they observe the students and evidence for those students learning, rather than observing the teacher. The teacher is almost invisible within this form of observation. The lesson then finishes. One embellishment to lesson study could be to either interview a focus group or individuals who were in the lesson to see how they felt they were learning and what the process was that they were involved in, how successful they think they've been, to perhaps do scrutinies of some of their work to get an idea of how well their work suggests they've understood it and what some of the issues might have been. And having done this, the group then evaluate the lesson, but it doesn't start with, how well do you think it went, or I like this bit of the lesson that you did. It's very much a discussion about students learning. And coming out from that is a reflection on the lesson that may lead to amendments and a reteaching to a parallel group, or may go on to the next lesson. But the whole idea really is to really dig very deeply into the pedagogy and try to understand the process of the lesson in depth. Now, I've been involved in both of these approaches to development. I've done DBR with groups of people. I've done it on my own practice with students. And for the last year, 18 months, I've been involved in lesson study again with colleagues in schools, but also on my own teaching with a colleague within the department at the university. And therefore I sort of got to think, well, if we really want to embed a deeper understanding of what's going on in curriculum and technology developments, if we want to really genuinely embed technology within practice, perhaps we could take a form of hybrid approach, or what I'm calling lesson design research. And in this case, in this diagram, really, this is trying to get at the idea that we've got a longer term idea of technology and curriculum development, say within an area of work, but where we think there are really important, almost sort of crux points within that longer term planning, particular lessons that are going to exemplify important developments that we're trying to create within that wider system. We use that as an opportunity to carry out lesson study cycles, so that not only are we developing the curriculum and or the technology, but we're beginning to unpack really quite crucial elements of that process in far more detail to open up a pedagogical discussion that will help the wider development of the system that we're trying to create and develop. At the moment, this is also part of some work we're doing and a bid we're putting together for a large-scale EU project, a multilateral project strand, where we'll be working hopefully with colleagues from a couple of other countries. And in the present EU call, one of the foci is to look at issues around skills and teaching and learning, and there's 4 elements to the particular focus: sort of strengthening the learning of basic skills, identifying and developing teaching and learning approaches or methods that can support the development of transversal key competencies such as digital literacy, ways of assessing and evaluating those methods, and bringing a European dimension. So what we're looking at really, in very general terms, these very sketchy research questions at the moment as we begin to write the bid, is to look at the extent to which this sort of hybrid lesson design research approach can aid in the integration of technologies and pedagogy in classrooms, to look at how it aids the development of learning skills and multiple literacies, etc., and to also look at the degree to which it can sustainably support the utilization of technologies in classrooms. The important element there being sort of longer term sustainable inclusion and embedding. To give one example, which is already underway in terms of a pilot study, I'm working with a colleague in a local sixth form college who teaches A-level politics, and the way that we've started to go around this, it's very early days at the moment, but we started off from the sort of lesson study end and just sort of asked what the learning challenge might be. What is it? What's sort of one of the central areas of work that they do within that course that could be developed? And very quickly, sort of the idea that came to the fore was getting the students to more successfully link their study of week-by-week current affairs and interrogating those current affairs through the political theory that they're covering within their course. The concern being that perhaps that ability to deconstruct and understand and begin to synthesize ideas from current affairs through the lens of political theory could be developed more than it is at present. And when discussing that, we decided that we'd like to use Web 2 to develop digital literacy, but also to develop more sort of basic general skills around sort of reflection and research. And therefore what we came up with, as you can see in the diagram, is a design-based research element with a curriculum development and a technological development looking at digital literacy. So we're going through sort of various phases over about a 2 or 3 month period, with students beginning to have structured approaches to looking at the link between current affairs and political theory through weekly synthesis of that week's news, working in groups to create PowerPoint slides to then feed back and as used as a sort of a summary and an ignition point for discussion about the link between the two. Having started to get that sort of structure and way of thinking, to then move that into the use of personal blogs, so that over the week individual students are actually blogging about at least 2 news events and their relation to political philosophy, so a minimum of 2 blog posts over the week, with some students looking at one national newspaper, other students looking at a different national newspaper. Once they've got into the habit of doing that and sort of creating the blog during the week, and then calling up the blog posts in lessons to use them again as a basis for discussion, then moving on so that not only are they looking at a newspaper, online newspaper, but also looking and comparing that with a politically contrasting think tank website with its sort of regular updates. So they're beginning to widen the information they're gaining, but continuing to create their blog. Then moving on to being put into pairs with contrasting information in each case. So one person in the pair looking at a particular newspaper and an alternative think tank, the other person in the pair looking at another newspaper, a different newspaper, and a different think tank, so that the subtleties of the information they're looking at are different. Creating blog posts and then having to comment on each other's posts, so it becomes co-reflection. And then towards the end, getting students to begin to sum up their emergent thoughts and ideas and understanding of the link between current affairs and political theory by working in pairs to create a wiki page about any particular event over the period that they found interesting, and then relating that to political theory. So the idea from a curricular and technological point is that it's utilizing Web 2 technologies in different ways. It's widening their digital literacy. It's also doing that alongside the development of a different style of curriculum approach. But then when we looked at it, we sort of said, well, okay, then if we're really going to sort of begin to understand the use of the technology, if we're going to really begin to embed the technology from a pedagogical point of view, so the pedagogy comes first and informs the way that the technology is being using, where do we begin to unpack this in greater depth? And therefore we decided that the best way of doing this was to do a lesson study cycle at each of the transition points. So for example, when the students move from PowerPoint to blog, only 2 of the 20 students have ever written a blog, 18 of them have only ever, if you like, consumed the information on a blog. And therefore we will plan in detail that lesson about what is, how are we going to introduce it to them, what issues are there in getting them using blogs positively and safely, what are issues are there about helping them understand how to use a blog, and how best to present it. How are we going to get them to think about the information that they need to collect and where they collect that from, etc. And then each time there's a transition in the use of different digital literacies, what we're doing is we're unpacking that from a pedagogical point of view, so that by the end of the curriculum, not only is the curriculum and the technology being developed, but there's a far deeper pedagogical understanding about how that embedding can happen and how it can happen successfully. A different example is one that we're hoping to start after the Christmas break with another friend who has got to the stage where he's challenging himself really at a very deep level about how he actually knows that students have learnt what he wanted them to learn during a lesson, that actually many of the ways that we go about doing plenaries either are quite cursory, or we only know how a few people have done, that actually is learning that simple, is learning bite-sized. Can we genuinely say how well somebody's learned something towards the end of a lesson? And that led to a discussion recently where I was arguing, because of my interest in complexity thinking, that actually all learning is emergent, and the notion that we can get a very clear idea of learning at the end of any single lesson is actually quite simplistic, and that all learning is emergent. All learning develops over time and is part of a network of ideas, and therefore we don't go from sort of 1 minute not knowing something and understanding it to the next minute knowing it and understanding it. We go through degrees of development. And from having this discussion and sort of trying to problematize those kinds of ideas, what we eventually came up with was this idea that whilst the knowledge and the understanding are absolutely crucial, what's underlying that and what is emergent, or one of the big features of that sort of emergent learning, is their understanding and learning of underlying concepts. And therefore there happens to be a scheme of work that students will be starting sometime in the new year at GCSE level, and an example of just part of that is given in the box on this slide. And what we're heading towards is sort of thinking about sort of planning for a scheme of work, but really trying to interrogate the content, to distill out, to precipitate out the really big underlying concepts, and then beginning to think about how we design a curriculum, some curriculum development around that, but also where those sort of crux lessons might be, where we might begin to sort of test and think about and really get to grips with the depth of the pedagogical thinking in terms of trying to take and help their learning go forward and see how it emerges over time. So within, say, a 2.5 month period, we may have 3 or 4 lesson study cycles at particular points where we look at particular facets or particular parts or concepts that we're interested in, and try to get a much deeper, clearer window on what's going on. And then obviously as we move to the end of that, this idea of general design principles, asking whether or not we've learnt anything pedagogically, whether we've learnt anything in a curricular sense, and therefore are there sort of general design principles that we can take forward from that to make some of the insights more sustainable over time. So this is sort of an emerging idea that we're beginning to pilot and test, but it's based, lesson design research, which is sort of a hybrid name I'm giving at the moment, is this idea of thinking about design, thinking about pedagogy and the link between pedagogy and curriculum and technology, based on notions of complexity and emergence, based on the idea that pedagogical expertise in relation to technology, thinking about pedagogy and learning as being emergent ideas and principles, are central to the process that's going on here, and that actually the understanding we gain is actually, you know, quite heavily contextualized. Something else I'm taking from complexity thinking is the idea that actually lesson study is looking at detail over a short period, perhaps a lesson, whereas design-based research is the more general level. It's a different scale. And complexity thinking, or part of complexity thinking, especially through people like Davis and Samara, is this idea of level jumping, the idea that you look at things at different scales but look at how they network together to give you a more holistic understanding of an issue. And therefore lesson design research in a sort of fairly simplified way is made up of lesson study, where we're looking at learning challenges and trying to get a lens on pedagogy, trying to understand and unpack and evaluate and critique approaches to pedagogy, but at the same time looking at a different scale with design-based research, which is more about the medium-term design and the emergent design principles around embedding and use of technology, or the design of successful curricula. And therefore the hoped for result of this is that it's a very useful praxis-based framework for the critical development for those involved of their understanding of pedagogy, their understanding of curriculum and technology, and how those various things can fit together, and therefore consequently, hopefully, notions of professional understanding and growth.